This is the Kundalini Collective podcast number 14, and today we have Jeannet Weurman. Jeanette is a member of the collective, and she was introduced to us personally through Katie Mottram. Jeanette is somebody who's gone through the journey of psychedelics and Kundalini, and has quite an extensive knowledge of the process and quite unique experiences. So I'm going to let Jeanette introduce herself and tell us about her journey.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And just to acknowledge that I'm feeling slightly nervous about this, but really looking forward to our conversation. I come from Holland originally, and have lived in Britain since '74, so I've been here a while. And I've always been desperate, really, to know that there is more to reality than just our physical material existence, the five senses that we can be aware of. And I first tried holotropic breathwork in 1997, and that was a real breakthrough. I started to have a sense of some energy phenomena and inner visions, and a sense that there was something more. And I was so bowled over by that experience that I sold my house within a month to go and do the training in holotropic breathwork with Stan Grof in the States. So that was in the late 90s. And during that time, I was doing intensive meditation as well. And at the end of the training, I then went and lived in the States for a year because I thought I could apprentice there. But in fact, it took almost a year for a place to come free. So I used that year to experiment with psychedelics, which I'd never done in my, many people have early experiences of it in their teenage years and young adulthood, but I had never done that. But I'd heard Stan Grof lecture with so much passion and love for that, the work, the therapeutic application of psychedelics, that I thought, okay, I want to experience this. And in fact, holotropic breathwork is a way of entering those states that don't involve substances and therefore weren't illegal, because of course this research was all closed down. So during that time, I tried psilocybin, I tried MDMA. The psilocybin wasn't a very high dose, I don't think. MDMA, which wasn't a very happy experience. I used LSD once, which again was a very challenging and unpleasant experience. And then someone said, look, why don't you go to a Santo Daime meeting, which is using ayahuasca as a sacrament within religious worship. And that was a real breakthrough. The first time I went to one of those ceremonies, and I took ayahuasca 3 times. And during the ceremony, I'm so defended. Nothing much happened in a psychedelic sense. But once I got back to my bedroom and turned the lights out, it all started to kick off. And it was a very deep experience, which I can tell you about, but, ask me if you want that. And that was a real breakthrough. And I thought, yeah, this is a different reality that I've never been in touch with before. So I went to another one of their ceremonies, and then the whole thing I was living in Berkeley at the time, the whole gathering there closed down for the Christmas break, and the people that wanted to went to Mapia in Brazil, which is a community 2 days by canoe from the nearest road in the Amazon forest. So I decided I had to go. And that was probably the hardest experience I've ever had in my life. 6 weeks doing 14 all-night works well, I think one was in the daytime, but mostly they were all-night works. And I mean, talk of, my ego falling apart. I was like an amoeba on the floor, and some of the experiences were ecstatic, and some of them were, one in particular where I felt an entity was trying to take me over, were the most terrifying I've ever had in my life. I literally was a whimpering wreck on the floor. Um, so I came back from that. That would have been the beginning of 99. And thankfully had a month at Esalen, doing, it was a work scholar thing. So I was cleaning the toilets and, cleaning rooms and doing the laundry, which was a wonderful grounding experience to try and help me integrate. I had one more big work with psilocybin in Arizona with a friend of mine sitting for me. And that was that, in a way, that gave me everything I had wanted for from that year in the States and from my training, which was I felt dissolved without a body in a field of light, love, consciousness, wisdom, infinite compassion. And I had an experience that we are all individually known and deeply loved, which I it was everything I needed to feel and know, experience. So I then had to come back because my money ran out, basically. So I'd been there for a year, had a bit of time in a community, but not so relevant in this context. Came back, had to go back into doing social work in a mental health team, and I did mental health advocacy. And basically, I was left with a whole load of unintegrated material that I didn't know what to do with. And I basically encapsulated and put in a mental holding pen for future processing, because I didn't know what to do with it. Had these psychic attacks been real? Were these things out there and I just normally couldn't see them? So and in the end I had to let go of that question, because I there is no answer to it. In a sense, I knew it had been real for me at the time, and I had just had to let it go. So for about, I don't know, 15 years, I tried to close everything down. I stopped meditating to not trigger the Kundalini energy, well, whatever the energetic stuff that was going on. I don't know if it was Kundalini. And I didn't do any breath work and no work with psychedelics. So it was only 2017 odd that I started to pick that up again. And I retired, I did some breath work, I did a bit of work with ayahuasca. And then I retired in 21, and I started doing a training in psychedelic assisted therapy with the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy in the UK. And I've just finished that. And as part of that, we had the opportunity of doing a project. So I wanted to try and understand the relationship between the energy that I feel at times, and it can come up with the breath work, it can come up spontaneously during the night, it can come up with psychedelics. And there is very little that I know of that is done in trainings to really make people aware that psychedelics can trigger, and holotropic breathwork can trigger Kundalini. It's not that it's not known about, but it's not really worked with in the training, or people aren't always prepared for it. So that's what I wanted to try and write about in my project. And I'm not an expert on any of the stuff that we're going to talk about. I'm just someone who had some weird experiences and is trying to make some kind of sense out of them.
That's a very interesting journey, and I want to just break it down. So you have your experiences with various types psychedelics. Then you've had holotropic breathwork, and you've had the Kundalini experiences. Just to take you back to your psychedelic experiences, do you feel, is there anything you want to say specifically about ayahuasca and what it brings to you and how it might differ from other types of psychedelics?
Well, so there's two things there. One is that people have written about this. Claudia Naranjo has looked at these different types of psychedelics, like LSD-like ones, the hallucinogens ones, or the ones that tap more into feeling and bodily awareness, or there's different types of psychedelics, and he writes about that. But in terms of my own experience, both my most profound experiences have been with psilocybin. One of those, well, actually, maybe three. One of those, the first one was, it felt like a more mental experience. And that it didn't involve bodily energies coming through. Then there was one, again, psilocybin, that was completely being overwhelmed by this torrent of energy flooding through me and out. And it 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 I experienced it as an act of worship and surrender to the goddess. But goodness knows what it was. And then the last big experience, which was actually fairly recently, I had a sense of co-creating with the divine, and this is not, these are not personal things, they're archetypal experiences, I think. With coming back to your question about the ayahuasca, it's much more difficult for me to make sense of my experiences with the ayahuasca. There isn't a story with it for me as much. I mean, I remember one amazing experience where I have encountered transpersonal beings, whatever we want to call them, like the Lady of the Forest, which was some feminine divine presence, and I just threw myself on the ground because all I could do was worship. And there were those encounters with entities, like that thing, whatever it was that I experienced, wanted to take me over. And I wondered, now, is this part of my shadow, my unconscious, a part of me that I split off, and I need to integrate it, let it in, invite it in, ask it, engage with it. And another bit thought, this feels so bad that all I could do was resist, and I didn't engage with it. In a way, now I wish I had, but I was too terrified at the time. And then and there are psychological ways of understanding those encounters. Donald Kulshed is if somebody's interested in that, really good person to read. So experiences with ayahuasca, yeah. So, and also mediumistic senses, like having a sense of being taken over by things, and being taken into the light. I mean, ecstatic times, but there weren't. It's more difficult for me to get a handle on the ayahuasca ones, I have to say. Does that make it? Does my answer make some kind of sense? Does that answer your question? And of course, it's a purgative. You're constant. There's a lot of vomiting and the other. It's harsh on the system.
I think the plant medicine has different qualities to it. So my experience with ayahuasca, everyone's got their own individual experiences, but it's definitely different to my experiences with psilocybin.
Yeah.
And with psilocybin, I feel there's a more cosmic connection. It can be. Whereas with ayahuasca, it feels way more ecological. It feels like I'm mushrooms can be ecological. It can, but with ayahuasca, I feel there's something very, very, very present in me. It's more embodied. So I've had, I think they're different qualities. But then I guess you, just to kind of break down your journey, you talked about the Santo Daime process, and you said that you had 14 nights of ayahuasca. So that's quite a heavy thing to go through. That must have changed you, to go through that in a couple of months in South America. I know you may not have memories of it, but do you feel there's some kind of process? There's a higher process to this journey, and can you maybe elaborate a little bit on what it might be, whether it's the specific 14 days you went through, or whether it's the whole journey? What are these psychedelics doing to you, and how are they helping you through your own journey?
Gosh, that's a huge question. I definitely feel I'm on a journey. And although, of course, at any moment, I have a choice about how I go forward, I also feel that increasingly, I'm quite, from childhood, I'm quite a controlled kind of person. And I think what it's doing is it's helping me to loosen up and um, be guided. And I think the initial period of the holotropic breathwork and the intensive meditation up to 3 hours a day, and the experience with mostly the ayahuasca, but a little bit the psilocybin, that last journey, that led up to, I think that was an overwhelm. And I think my system, partly because, I mean, I wasn't in therapy. I mean, I had lots of therapy by that time, but I wasn't in therapy and I couldn't afford more therapy. And so I wasn't really able to, other than read, I wasn't able to do anything with these experiences. So I think my system kind of closed down. And also I had to work, I had to perform, and as it was, I ended up burning out. I was too open to the people I was trying to support, and I basically went off from work. I couldn't. I was taking on too much. So that was a kind of overwhelm and closing down, and it's only been in the last say, I don't know, 7 years that I've started to open up again. And this time, I think it's been more better managed. I've managed it better. I've had more opportunities to um, integrate. And I think the training I did with the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy has really helped me to find a way of relating to what I've experienced. And I'm not saying that the way I made sense of it is right, but it's helping me. So I mean, in a way, that's the important thing. It's not whether somebody's right or wrong, but we all, for ourselves, need to find some way of relating to material like this. And how do we make meaning out of it? How do we embed it in our lives? And I think I think I'm well, I spend a lot of time trying to support awareness in other people in different ways, uh, offering spaces where people can explore things. Like I'm jointly with other people, I run a psychedelic integration group, and things like here talking about this. I mean, I try and put my experience out there, for better or for worse, so that it maybe encourages other people to explore and find their own meaning.
I've got a question, Jeanette. You know, it's around in a way that differentiating being on a transformative journey to having an experience. So, for instance, Bonnie Greenwell will talk about Kundalini and sort of suggest that once Kundalini has really erupted, then that person, in a way, if they like it or not, are on a transformative journey. Do you think people can be on such a journey through the use of psychedelics, or what do you think? What makes someone become on a transformative journey rather than just having an experience? I can't. I'm trying to think how to frame the question. But do you know what I'm trying to say? Do you know? Have you any thoughts like why some people may find themselves on a transformative journey and some people are having almost like recreational experiences? Have you any thoughts on that?
I don't know what the difference is, but the way I would answer it is some people have a sense of an inner calling, and whether that's a calling towards, Jung would say individuation, a call by the self, something bigger than ourselves that is driving our transformative journey. I think we're actually, everyone is on a transformative journey. It's just where we are on it and whether we're aware of it. But I can't imagine anybody not being on one because it's part of life. It's life, the life force working towards greater coherence, greater integration, greater complexity, greater awareness, consciousness. That's how I understand it. Does that make sense?
Yes, and do you think someone can, as I said, so Bonnie would have said that Kundalini Awakening has that, you are sort of on that journey. Do you think that's the same with the use of psychedelics? That
Yeah.
it's yeah.
I as I understand it, that would make sense to me. Yeah.
Jeanette, let me ask you this question about the use of psychedelics and shamanism, and then let's look at it from the view of people going through Kundalini Awakening. So, as far as I understand it, historically, South American tribes would take versions of ayahuasca and they would commune with the spirits and they would get answers. So they would get into a certain state. They would have using techniques involving song, Icaros, and other types of ritualistic practice. They would have a conversation and they would come back with answers. Now, the person doing that, as far as I understand it, would be the shaman, although I think other people would do it as well. And the shaman would act as a conduit with one foot. They'll take less ayahuasca than the practitioners, but they would have one foot in the real world, one foot in the spirit world, and help people. So there's a ritual there which kind of makes sense in the context of what they're going through. Now we look at Kundalini in the East. Historically, it is practiced as a way to experience a oneness, a non-dual state, to transfer. Some people, it's to transform the body. So, two different intentions. One from the East, one from shamanic practices in South America. So, where is the correlation? Where one is about conversing with spirit, with the Kundalini practice that even say, when you do see spirits, ignore them. Don't. They're irrelevant to your journey. Keep going. If you have siddhis, if you have powers, ignore them. Keep going. So using these two different cultures, where is the correlation? I mean, I have my own opinion, but I'm asking you yourself: where's the correlation from the cultural kind of foundation?
I mean, I don't know, but the way that I would start to think about that question is through that if it feels like there are these different traditions, theories, approaches, practices that are all different. Maybe culturally, they've grown out of their own ecology and culture. So the way I think of it is they're different sides of a mountain. And we're all climbing the mountain, but we have different perspectives because we're on the different side of it. And maybe the core of the mountain, there is an experience which is the same for everyone, universally, all humans. Um, but our different lenses mean that we experience different aspects of it, different we interpret our experiences in different ways, and maybe that even influences what we can experience. It's very difficult to experience something that you haven't got a mental construct for, or a feeling, that a feeling that you haven't got a word for. It's so I think where we're coming from affects what we see. And so my interest was in what is that core experience, and I took that to be the experience of the numinous, a sense of something that is transcendent, divine. I don't use that term in a religious sense at all, but something that's bigger than us, a consciousness that, and maybe the what Bohm calls the implicate order, or the Irvin Laszlo calls it the Akashic field, some kind of field of consciousness out of which everything emerges and in which everything is embedded. So yeah, so then coming back to that polarity, or that juxtaposition between the shaman and the purpose with which the shaman might, they might want to offer healing, or look for something that's been lost, or bring a part back for a person that has been split off. Whereas perhaps in Hinduism, tantric teachings, you might go for that non-dual consciousness. So the purpose with which you approach it, the longing in your heart, if you like, might influence what comes up. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, first of all, I think I agree. I think if you look for a global model, there's a non-materialist space that all cultures seem to acknowledge, and that you can tap into using different techniques: meditation, yoga, sex, psychedelics, and dancing. So in that space, each culture has its own way of conversing with the energy within that. So I think there's a psychedelic experience and the tantric experience. I think they're quite parallel. But I also think they have different purposes. Whereas there's shamanic experience, and when we say shamanism, obviously we're talking about multiple cultures and multiple continents. They seem to acknowledge the earth as a living entity, and the need to work with the ecology of the area, which might just be their land. With the Hindu experience, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert in this, but it doesn't feel like that it's about the earth necessarily. It feels like it's about something else. It's about transcending the laws of nature, space, and time. When you read about some Hindu lineages, it almost seems fairly selfish, because they want to have some kind of eternal life, or have a blissful state forever. That's the kind of like they acknowledge that we want to have somebody forever. So it feels there's an intention there, and it feels different. I'm not even going to say one is better, one is worse. It just feels different. But they both acknowledge, as you said, the numinous, this energetic field. I want to reference Rupert Sheldrake. He talks about the morphogenic field, and the Cambridge professor who suggests that all animals and all trees and plants share one energy, and that information can be spread across. We don't have to communicate with words. So I think this idea of the numinous makes complete sense. But then the question would be, well, what's going on now? Because modern Europeans, or whoever, people who take ayahuasca, are no longer trying to communicate with the spirit of their ecology. Maybe they are, but they don't know. It seems like they're doing some kind of therapy. So there's a therapeutic benefit now, which I don't know whether shamans 500 years ago in the Amazon would have said, let's take ayahuasca for therapy. They wouldn't have looked at it in that way. So, and also with mushrooms as well. The history of mushrooms, I'm not sure whether it was taken as a therapeutic benefit. So something new is happening. So there's a cultural shift. And also, Anna and myself talk about the Kundalini journey as a transformative experience. I don't know whether the old gurus would have looked at it as work on yourself necessarily in the way that we're looking at that. So all three of us are bringing a whole new cultural perspective to these historic practices. So I'm going to throw it back to you and Alan. What exactly are we doing when we put our own now narrative on these historical cultural practices?
Can I just chip in there as well? So, sort of question, Jeanette, is there some kind of almost like concoction happening here where different traditions are being all mixed up? So in the cauldron, so to speak, to bring another tradition in. Yeah. Do you think this is what's happening? That because actually, as Samir was saying, I mean, I'm not an expert on shamanism, but I know a bit, and that is very much it's not so much for the individual transformation. It's a group very much earth driven, and so in a way, Westerners are approaching it in a different way than it was originally intended. And as Samir has very eloquently said, the way we perceive Kundalini in the West is actually very different from how it originated in India. Have you any thoughts on what's happening in this sort of mix and match situation?
I do think something new is emerging. And the way that I've tried to think about that is in using Jung's idea of complexes. And I don't know if this is right or not, but it's one way of maybe of thinking about it, that, there's one sort of way of, the numinous experience of Kundalini is very powerful. So that could be the emotional core around which unconscious individual and collective material organizes itself and forms a complex. And that core is a kind of archetypal patterning or energy. So if that's right, then the East would have a form of a Kundalini complex, how they understand it, experience it, make sense of it. South American shamanism would have a form of Kundalini complex. And I think what may be happening, question mark, is that in the West, we are now creating our own form of the Kundalini complex. And Lee Sanella started, I forget, in the 70s sometimes, I think, he started doing research into this. And more recently, this research is still going on, looking at how Westerners experience the phenomena of Western Kundalini experience. And they're finding that lots of Westerners are experiencing energetic phenomena that look a bit like Kundalini energy, but it's slightly different. And so maybe, and Naranja calls it a Kundalini phenomenon. So, a looser definition of what's going on rather than the strictly, the classical Kundalini definitions from Tantric Shaivism or, those classical texts. And if that's right, if we're creating a new complex, then that might account for why more experiences keep happening, because as you start to have an idea of what it could be, it's more easy to experience it. So it's a sort of a virtuous circle, really, as collectively we start to develop this complex. then more of us can have access to the experiences, which then feeds into the complex and it becomes bigger. And it does, I think we do bring a psychological understanding that perhaps, or focus that perhaps these other cultures didn't have in the same way. I mean, Jung says that the Eastern, I mean, again, is this right or we don't know, but his view was that the Eastern psychology is very different from Western psychology, because for us the ego is center, and we look at, you know, how is it formed, how does it relate to the external world, you know, whereas in the East the focus is on the new non-dual, and the ego is seen as a potential hindrance to experiencing the non-dual. So it's looking at how can we suspend the ego while we go into these deeper or more transcendent states. Sorry, what were you going to say? Yeah.
Okay, so let's suggest that there's a modern phenomenon happening, and what you're saying is correct. So we have these different cultures historically who all acknowledge at least a non-material existence, a connection to something which is bigger than the body and bigger than the earth, but the land, a non-physical space that we can all connect with, that has a kind of transcendent experience, whatever that might mean. And then in the 21st century and the 20th century, people are beginning to aggregate these different spaces into a kind of new idea. And now we're having a conversation about it, as Alan said, which is very relevant. We're now looking at transformative experiences. But that seems to be a process where people want to engage with, in which they can deal with their own inner shadow or their trauma and progress, which wasn't the original intention, you know, hundreds of years ago. So there seems to be this new interpretation is something that we're coming to now. So what is it saying about, my question to again to both of you is, what is it saying about our culture? What is needed now? And is there something about the individual here? Because in the past, at least with shamanism, there was something more collective about the experience, something more about the community and more about the group. So a bunch of individuals in the West who are now taking ayahuasca, doing holotropic breathwork, who are doing meditation and tantric work in order to connect with something more. What is this new phenomenon? Where is it coming from? And why is it needed? And I'm not saying I know the answer, I'm just putting it out there.
I think definitely, I remember when I was in South America doing those journeys in Mapia, the focus was very much on collective works. They called them works. And us spiritual tourists were, it was kind of slightly frowned upon, with a kind tolerance, but that we saw it in terms of individual work, and they really didn't. It was a collective work to raise consciousness. So another thought that I had as you were talking was that psyche or consciousness infuses the material. So when we talk about a different focus, like whether it's a therapeutic, personal, psychological focus, or, you know, of individual healing, or whether it is about healing physical illness, or whether it's about looking at the environment and how, you know, all these things, I think they are all reflections of each other. So although we may experience it as work in one modality, if you like, in fact, we're working on all these levels at the same time because they're the same thing. It's just our way of seeing it that makes it different. Do you think that's right?
I think, I mean, I like what you're saying. I think working on yourself, inner work, is to some extent linked to outer work. So unless you work on yourself, you can't necessarily create change outside. And the two, there's a synergy between inner work and outer work. So I 100% think that. I also think there's something about post-Second World War Earth, where we've moved very quickly into a different psychological state, where in the past people were more had to work and had to survive, and that nowadays people have time to think. And I feel that generation after generation are now accepting that they have ancestral trauma and they're dealing with it within one generation, whereas in the past they may have just pushed it out to the next generation. They're kind of looking inside of themselves for the first time. They have the space and time to do so, and in doing so, they're confronting all their inner demons and fears. And techniques like ayahuasca are probably tools that people can use to help that. But I guess what I'm getting at is it feels like there's a global story, it's a global narrative. We've had thousands of years of connection to a numinous transcendent experience, and we've had about 70 years now of coming together, of connecting to it in a new way, where we're dealing with our inner fears in our shadow for some kind of transformative experience. And what does that mean? What's happening to us, and it's probably, in my opinion, contributing to a growth in spontaneous awakening. So more and more people are experiencing this without the aid of drugs, or maybe taking ayahuasca, as you said, and we could talk about this, leads to that kind of opening of where you connect with something more. But ayahuasca was only available to a very few people 100 years ago, and now millions of people can access it. So something new is happening again. So just opening it up to the idea of what might be happening now and where is it leading to?
Something exponential.
Yeah.
It sounds like something is growing. Yeah. And one other dimension to this that when I saw the cat, I got sidetracked on, but with the ayahuasca, there was an experience, one journey where it felt like I was called upon to witness the suffering of the Holocaust. And that was obviously pretty challenging. And I had a guide in the form of a person-sized praying mantis, but there was something helping me tolerate this. And the idea was that by witnessing it, a bit like a counselor witnessing the pain in a client, by witnessing the pain on the level of the collective psyche, we are helping to metabolize it and to process it, and so that it can move through. So I think that's another, and I don't know whether that falls into the more shamanic dimension or model of understanding these things, but I think it's a very important piece, whether that comes through Kundalini or whether through psychedelics or whether through meditation, but we can process something if we allow our individual psyche to open up to the collective and in service to it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Jeanette, because I found myself thinking about maybe when people are seeking some kind of spiritual connection or spiritual advancement, maybe there's some misunderstanding in the sense that maybe because all spiritual paths leads to this sense of oneness. So the idea of being individual about this, I'm wanting to reach a higher level, you could argue is missing the point, because that's actually about how do we improve the collective, make it better for everybody, and not just everybody, but all the rest of the consciousness. Yeah. Have you thoughts how the individual experience? You've already mentioned this. Would you like to expand a bit more on how the individual experience might relate to the greater experience, both in the sense of how perhaps the individual experience can be triggered by what's happening on the greater scale, and the influence the individual can have on the collective?
Yeah, God, these are such interesting and huge questions, aren't they? The relationship between the individual and the collective psyche, and perhaps that level of the numinous, the underlying implicate order or consciousness out of which everything emerges. I guess I use, to a large extent, a mixture of Jungian understanding, where we have our own individual psyche, and then there is the collective psyche, and there is a kind of field in between where the two sort of enmesh. So your individual feelings, memories, behaviors, and so on are kind of organized, perhaps partly by archetypal patterning, and complexes can arise and so on. But all of this is, I see it as the reflection of this underlying field of consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, energy, or out of which everything comes. So perhaps it's that, going back to emergent properties, maybe all of us, material and psychic representations in existence, are an expression of that field and unfolding within that field as part of it coming to know itself. I mean, there are lots of people that say that much better than I can, but that is the model that I use, that there is something that is beyond comprehension, that is unfolding through us and through everything that exists. And perhaps there may be other intelligences as well, but humans offer something quite precious, which is that we can reflect on this, and we can maybe contribute towards that, it coming to know itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
So I'm going to segue into your thoughts about this post psychedelic experience that people are having, where they may be having Kundalini experiences, and you're talking about how there isn't enough information out there for people who want to go into psychedelic experiences to know that it could actually open something else in them. And what we've been building up to in this conversation is, well, what is the link between ayahuasca, or not ayahuasca, any kind of psychedelic, and the Kundalini journey? Within, just to give some background, historically in the Hindu text, there is a drink called soma, or som, S-O-M-A, which nobody actually knows what it is, but it was meant to be it does seem to connect you with something more. Shiva also smoked marijuana. I mean, it's controversial, but there are types of sadhus in India who some people look down at, but they spend the whole day smoking marijuana and are in an ecstatic trance the whole time. A bit like the Kogi, who use coca leaves to be in an ecstatic trance, or an ecstatic state. These sadhus use marijuana. So India does have a history of connection to, we call it plant medicine. Marijuana is plant medicine also. It does talk about som, although nobody knows what it is. I think some gurus in India are suggesting som could be ayahuasca, but that might not make sense because ayahuasca is definitely a South American plant. So what we're saying is that psychedelics, though, might be triggering Kundalini. And the question then is, because I doubt that shamans 500 years ago thought about this or even referenced it in the way that we're referencing it. If it happened, they wouldn't put it Kundalini. And if it did happen, there would be some oral tradition about this, which I don't know whether there is. I haven't come across it from the shamanic traditions about some kind of post-psychedelic opening that's transformative. So I'm just going to give to you, the both of you, is there something new happening with psychedelics in the human race? Is it triggering something that wasn't triggering something before? And if it is, or if it is even if it's not new, what does it say about, I guess, our species? That's a big question. If we don't understand what's happening. So we take plants, we have an experience of another kind of spatial dimension. We come back to reality, and suddenly our whole world is transformed, and we keep having insights. What is it suggesting about our modern reality?
Alan?
Well, I mean, I take a. I wasn't expecting to be asked actually, Jeanette. But I don't know. I mean, I take a totally. I personally take a totally different angle on this. In that, I mean, I see it as being more of an issue of epoch. So that the say, well, just as a metaphor, say the Piscean age is being an epoch that's ended up with industrialization and very much these so-called one side of humanity dominating and the male dominating. And it'd be interesting to know your thoughts on the power of the feminine in transformation. But it would, to me, we're coming to a crisis stage, and something we've not talked about about trauma and crisis, how trauma and crisis can so-called crack the egg and then can lead to Kundalini and spiritual transformation, can lead to spiritual experiences. And the way I look at it is because the damage that humanity is doing, we're coming to a stage where more people have to wake up to the greater reality. Otherwise, humanity will destroy, when we've already destroyed a lot, the natural world. So that's an angle that in my mind is quite central to what's happening. It's part of a new epoch.
Yeah.
I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Epochs is not a word that I usually think in terms of, but I can see what you're saying, and I think we're definitely at a crisis point generally in our husbandry of nature and of the world. And I think feminine consciousness is a key element of that. So in terms of the emergence of new ways of new insights following a psychedelic journey and perhaps Kundalini experiences. And you were saying, Samir, about how in other cultures they might not, question mark, have they experienced Kundalini? And if so, where is it written about? How did they experience it? And perhaps that goes back to having these different lenses, that we experience different things according to the culture we come out of. One of the questions that I've wondered about is the two different ways that my extreme points of opening have been. Some of them have been very physical and embodied and energy based, and others have been more perhaps mental. They're both heart openings and a total surrender to process, but there are more mental ways of that coming out with light and color and visions and not so much an embodied physical experience. So coming back to what it says about us now, that if something new is emerging, I think part of what's happened in Western culture is that the listening to deep psyche and the experience, the direct, intuitive, embodied, relational experience of deep psyche has got repressed by patriarchy because that's a more ego based way of being and more intellectual maybe, or where there's different parts of the brain that are being accessed, who knows. But So I think what we need to do now, and maybe that's an emergent thing that's coming up, we've become unbalanced and something is readjusting the balance. So this feminine consciousness, feminine wisdom way of being and relating needs to come up, and I think is coming up to balance the way that we show up in the world. And I think that's the teaching of nature, that we need to align ourselves better to the collective, to the whole, to the unity that's underlying everything. And that comes back to the collective rather than the individual. We're all individual things. We need to be more like ants, or bees, or work together in a way that is transcending the individual. And it doesn't mean that we can't be individuals anymore, but we can't put ourselves first all the time. Is this answering your question, Samir? I got a bit lost with your question.
I know, sorry, I realized I put too many questions in one sentence. But it does. There was a question about this idea that psychedelics cause a Kundalini experience, post-psychedelic experience, are people having some kind of Kundalini reaction to it? And if that's a new phenomenon, is it a new phenomenon? And if it is a new phenomenon, what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know that it can be a totally new phenomenon. I think we are experiencing it in a unique way. But the reason I think it can't be a totally new phenomenon is that I think the way that these different techniques, whether it's holotropic breathwork or psychedelics or meditation or yoga or whatever, trance, they all temporarily suspend or put on the back burner our default mode network, our habitual ways of experiencing ourselves, experiencing the world, so that a wider field of awareness can come in and new connections can be made in our experience, in our feelings, and how we think. And it and if that is the mechanism, then that has to have always been that the mechanism is the same. It's just our experience of it is maybe different. Do you think that could be right?
Yes, I think, but what I would say is that the quality, so this is my own personal opinion, the quality of the energy that comes from an ayahuasca experience is not the same quality that comes from a Kundalini awakening experience. Doesn't mean that I think they're complementary, first of all. So the important thing to notice that all these global phenomena are complementary phenomena. I think they originate and they circulate differently. So we talk about having experience that's opening, but then you've had the body experiences. Someone could translate that the energy is going up and the energy is going down. I think these different cultures bring an individual and unique flavor to the global awakening experience, and they work complementarily. I also think that not all of them historically are non-dual. And the important thing that's happening now is that it is non-dual. I'll try to explain this. If you look at the shamanic techniques, look at the books of Carlos Castaneda, and if you've read the books of Don Juan. But the shamans had evil. They had teachers that were bad. You could use that connection to do, let's say, curses, and it wasn't like people they weren't doing it for necessarily good reasons. Some people followed the rituals to do things for bad reasons. So these cultural connections to something bigger, I think, are dualistic. They have and I think some of them, not all of them, like the tantric positions and the Buddhist positions, will at the end unite the male and female, and they have the experience of the non-dual. Other shamanics don't go that far. I think they recognize the duality and also the need to live in a duality, because their ecosystem might be fighting another ecosystem. Like two different shamans in two different parts of the territory would have two different, perspectives of what to do. So what's happening now, and I think this is the thing about ayahuasca, is that the DMT experience, and that, people haven't taken DMT, taken ayahuasca, but people who take DMT straight, they seem to go straight into a space that is completely hyper reality. Not even the ayahuasca.
I've not experienced that.
Yeah, but when you read about people smoking pure DMT, they're going somewhere else. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think that the ayahuasca journey is beginning to open up people. I'm just giving you a conscious stream. It might be the case that in the past, ayahuasca wasn't meant to or wasn't supposed to take you to a non-dual space. You're communing with the spirits. It was a unified space of communing with the spirits, but you still have a dualistic perspective. You are separate from the spirit. Whereas in the Valpa Samadhi, the high state of Samadhi, there's no difference between you and the Akashic field. You're one with Brahman. So I don't think that the shamans were trying to go that high or that far. I don't think ayahuasca was used for that way. So, but I've had experiences on ayahuasca where I've gone pretty far up that field, and I get the feeling that it can take you there, and DMT takes you there. So I think that it's being used for a different intention, and it's taking people to other spaces that it may not take. I don't know. Maybe it did take shamans to that space, but was there a need for a shaman in the forest 500 years ago to go to a non-dual Nirvana Samadhi space, or was the need for them to survive, for their community to survive and be at one with the ecosystem? So the intention now is shifted, and because it's shifted, we can now use ayahuasca to potentially have a non-dual state. And dimethyltryptamine is potentially linked to the pineal gland. There are some theories to say that it can be really, there's a link, and the pineal gland is what you might use to achieve samadhi. So I think there's something happening now that's new. I don't know whether shamans would have that their intention is so different to the intention of the ancient Indian tantric gurus. I mean, you could say they will have the same intention, that there's a kind of oneness in there, but I just don't feel personally that there was. So anyway, I think Alan wants to say something.
Well, yeah, as far as I understand, the shaman would be taking ayahuasca not for their own benefit, but to actually help others, help the tribe. It wasn't there for them hitting a particular state. It had a community purpose, and it does sound in a way that it's been sort of taken by the West to turn into this more individual seeking, which is maybe not that appropriate. But I suppose the view I'd like to throw in there is that my own personal view is that when Kundalini, or the energy, whatever you want to call the energy, has come through someone up to a certain level, then that puts someone on a long-term journey. Whereas I suppose the thought I like to throw in is that psychedelics themselves can take someone very high, but they come back down again. To me, my own personal view is they're not necessarily transformative. The way that there can be a transformation through psychedelics is, to me, similar to how there can be a transformation through trauma, in that if someone has a particularly powerful experience, it can sort of, in a way, crack the egg of the self, and the higher self can emerge. But I suppose I'm not so sure that psychedelics are transformative in the same way as a more organic, well, that's not the right word, is it? Than a so-called Kundalini awakening, when the energy comes right up and through. To me, that's put someone in a transformative space, whereas psychedelics put someone into an experience that tends to be more time limited. But that's just my own personal view. Don't know what your thoughts
maybe
are.
That's
Jeanette.
Maybe that's what Claudio Naranjo means when he says that psychedelics give a temporary Kundalini experience, or experience of opening up in some way, but it doesn't give the stable ability to access these states that meditation might. For instance, if you have a long-term meditation practice and really develop in that way, Is that what you were thinking of, Alan?
Not particularly, in the sense that the way I've experienced Kundalini is that the energy is so much more settled than she was when it first happened. But I through dreams and so forth, something is going on. There's something is going on. Whereas I'm not sure that psychedelics necessarily put someone in that process. I'm not. These are just my thoughts. I think there are people, especially Ayahuasca. I think there are people who've had Ayahuasca who and that's perhaps has triggered a Kundalini awakening, an energetic awakening. But I know people who've taken, like yourself, gone away and taken for weeks and weeks and had dozens of ceremonies, and I haven't seen that they've been actually transformed in a way that that perhaps a Kundalini awakening might do, and haven't been in a way forced to reprocess their trauma in the same way. But sorry, these are just my thoughts.
Yeah, no, maybe there is an element of intention. Could that be a useful way of thinking about it? That you can come to psychedelics with different intentions. You can take them at a party, which I wouldn't advocate, but people do, or you can use them as an inner journey, but for the experience, or you can use them with a deep longing to connect with that non-dual field. And maybe the intention is partly what determines whether there is a transformative potential, more or less transformative potential in it. With the Kundalini, it's interesting, isn't it? Whether they're different experiences, the classical Kundalini versus other types of energetic experiences, or whether they are just a lesser form of. I mean, I definitely haven't had a full Kundalini awakening, so I wonder whether the little bits that I've had might be just a lesser form of what advanced practitioners, enlightened beings have managed to access.
I think the first thing I'm going to say is I think this idea of enlightenment through Kundalini and spiritual awakening is probably the biggest red herring involved. The
biggest what? Sorry?
The biggest red herring.
Okay.
I agree.
Because clearly people are not enlightened who are having Kundalini awakenings. This includes all of us, all three of us, and everyone we ever met. No one's been enlightened by it. It's a process, and maybe you could say that the process is shining a light on trauma and it's allowing people to heal. This idea of enlightenment as a kind of noun, or a person who's enlightened, until I meet that person, and I might meet the person. I think the only way that ever happens, I wouldn't know that person's enlightened. If those people exist, we don't know who they are. They don't go out there and shout their name. So a more practical way to look at this is a process of healing. I think that's the first thing, a process of coming together, and a process of social and hopefully political change collectively. Right? That would be individual healing, group healing, community healing, world healing, and then coming together. This idea of enlightenment or enlightened people, if there is, would be somewhere very far down that journey when everyone collectively has been doing the work. So for 2024, for the next 20 years, what's happening? We're healing each other, we're healing ourselves, we're trying to figure out what's going on. And this conversation is really important, because what we're talking about is two traditions, or many traditions that have similarities and have differences but seem to be connected. And what it's shining a light on for me is the idea that probably the most important take home for me from all of these experiences is the idea that there's a connected field that connects everything, and that we can tap into it through different cultures. And
Yeah.
that connection that joins everything together, me, you, Alan, and we on some level are not acknowledging it completely. And that lack of acknowledgement is creating massive trauma and pain. And until we begin to understand that connection exists and the trauma and pain needs to be cleared in order to reveal that connection again, the idea of enlightenment is a kind of missing point. Where the important thing is there's a real connection that everything has, all people have, we all have. And the reason we probably suffer so much is because we don't acknowledge that. Not just we, society, etc., historically does not acknowledge that connection. But these different tribes and these different cultures do acknowledge that connection to some level. And maybe the Hindus almost go right to the top and forget about all the bits in between. Maybe the shamanic cultures are like dealing with a level, but they're still acknowledging on some level that this field exists. So for me, I'm beginning to feel that the important take home from all of this is just to acknowledge there's a connection between everything, everyone, and our spiritual awakening journeys are helping us acknowledge that, helping us realize that. And this idea of a transformative experience probably is happening to more and more people as they, even if you consciously get into that space and leave and you go back to work, that connection will always be there. And it might be a small connection, it might be a big connection, but you're going to be changed by it. And I guess the question that Alan's asking is that, the question I'm asking that Alan's raising is Kundalini transformative? And is the psychedelic experience the same? And I guess I would say that once you've had a connection to the luminous, I think you're always changed and you're always changing. However, there is definitely an experience that I've had with Kundalini where there's an inner guide, and I've had to learn to converse with that guide and create a language. And that guide has come out of the process. And the guide is cognitive and kinesthetic. So I feel it as energy. It's cognitive. My brain had to rewire itself. And the guide is me, but there's a language I've had to understand. And it could be physical, it could be mental, and it can create fear and pain in me. But actually, it's helping me understand a bigger world out there. Now, I've met some people who come to the Kundalini Collective who've taken psychedelics. We met one guy who took the ME5, the toad, the very, very, very powerful. And he joined our group because he was having a lot of trouble integrating the process. And he was still, I guess, connected to something more. And he had said he had a trauma of maybe a month just being in his bedroom and he couldn't leave because he was having a very difficult time. So and he came to our group feeling he was having some kind of Kundalini connection, and it could have been. So there is something going on where people are coming out of these experiences and they're still connected to some kind of energetic space, and they're not able to integrate that into everyday life. That's not too dissimilar from my very peak experience, where I found it very, very difficult to integrate the experience into everyday life. So maybe it doesn't matter, but the moment you connect into this outer space, if you come back into real life, really the important thing is how to integrate the fact that you've experienced a higher nature of reality. How do you integrate that? And the moment you begin to integrate it consciously, you realize that the only way to do so is to actually, in some way, work on your trauma and your shadow. Because on some level, the connection to that non-dual space or that energetic space is blocked by our trauma. And we hold our trauma in our energy fields, I guess, if you believe in that. And so the first thing that you begin to intuitively understand, especially if you go to Kundalini, is to start working on those spaces, because those are the blocks. And that, in fact, in Kundalini kind of literature, you have your nadis, and before Kundalini rises through your Sushumna, it has to balance from the left and right within Pingala. And you store your karma, your blocks in your channels. And so if you're going through a spontaneous awakening, you'll begin to spontaneously work on the blocks in your channels in order for, when I say spontaneous awakening, it means spontaneous pranic awakening before Kundalini rises. And you'll work through the different blocks in your channels automatically, and it could be spontaneous movement, it could be mudras, it could be yoga, and that would help channel the energy up. So what if, throwing it out there, hypothesizing, what if there's a global kind of, the engine is beginning to start, starting the car, and as the engine with the keys moving through, we're hitting the first sparks, and the sparks are hitting different people, and they're beginning to spontaneously awake through different means, and the engine is beginning to run, and at some point there'll be a sustainable awakening. But because we're halfway through this first spark flying, we're kind of like trying to push, but at some point enough energy will go into the engine, and everyone will start self-running and going on that transformative journey. We're coming to it through different techniques. I mean, that's the important thing. We're not just coming to it through Hindu Tantra, we're coming through different cultural techniques. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
It's a lovely image. I like that. Yeah. But one thought I did have in terms of integrating that connection with the numinous, I think you always said you can't actually integrate archetypal energy. So there are levels of experience, consciousness, not sure what to call it, but that can't be integrated into the small individual ego, and we have to just let it go and flow back into the collective, because if you try and hold on to it in the ego, you either, well, you don't fare well with that. So it may be that there are dimensions of experience that we can have, but that we can't fully integrate into our limited being.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
You make a good point. So if you look at some Buddhist tantric practitioners and also Hindu tantrics, at very high levels, they embody the bodhisattvas, they embody the deities, they become Shiva, they become a Manjushri or some entity. They don't embody that forever, but for a moment, they're bringing that energy into them and they become that deity. And from the ayahuasca experience, it does seem that there are entities out there that can embody, and I don't know whether that's dangerous or whether it's bad or good, but they have their own perspective of that. So we could suggest that there are archetypal spirits or energies that exist in these fields, and they have a purpose. I'm not going to say they're good or evil, they just have their purpose. And when you connect to these spaces, especially if you go through tantric methods, you embody the energies and you embody the deity, and these deities become you. Now, what their purpose is, why they exist, I don't know, but there is some kind of archetypal idea of kind of energy fields that seem to have a conscious character, and people begin to merge with them. But as you say, it's a temporary space, and it's almost the way, using my AI analogy, maybe we're plugging into the machine for a second, and we become the machine. And with that plugging in, we kind of draw out some of that energy, we become it, but you can't hold it because you're a human being. But you just go in there for a second and then you leave.
I mean, these are such huge questions and such important questions, aren't they? Like, what are we doing? Who are we as human beings, and what is happening through us individually and collectively? And can we influence what's happening? Can we? I mean, we were talking about, perhaps some shamans not having good intent. Can we influence the intent that humanity collectively has towards survival and the planet and other beings that have a right to be here as much as we have? How do we steer what's happening to an enriching outcome for everyone?
I think the one of the key themes that's come from this conversation is connection, isn't it? I think that's, to me, it's one of the key themes that's come through, and also the aspect that spiritual awakening, however it may be triggered, whatever, is actually to think of it as being some individual process is perhaps a misunderstanding, because to me, spiritual awakening is the experiential realization of the unity of existence, and that we are part of that unity. And this might sound a bit naive, but if you think about it, the more human beings recognize, either experientially or intellectually, that everything is one, then there is much more chance that human beings can actually start to solve the problems that ignorance, the system we've been living under for a long time is based on the idea of separation and competition. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. And if more and more people can actually recognize that the reality is the unity, then that to me is potentially a big part of the humanity actually solving the problems that humanity has created. So it's a very important collective journey. And Eckhart, Samir was giving the metaphor of a car firing up. Eckhart Tolle in the New Earth gave the metaphor of flowers. The fact, many years ago, you had the first flowers, and they were pretty quite fragile, and they get blown over, and but gradually, as time went on, there's more and more flowers, and so the more and more people waking up and flowering, the more chance we've got of actually, say, solving the problems that we've created.
Yeah. And listening to you talk reminds me of Chris Beisch. So he did, I think it's 72 or 73 high dose LSD sessions over about 20 years or something, and meticulously wrote up his journey and what he experienced. And one of the things, well, two things it's such an amazing journey. So I recommend his book. But two things that I was thinking about. One is that, and we mentioned trauma, that experiencing suffering, he went through huge amount of suffering before he got to these higher levels. And then, and that was not just individual suffering, that was collective suffering. But coming through that, he then had this experience of being taught almost. I don't know if taught is the right word, but he was, things were revealed to him, and he could experience things by expanding into them. And there was a dialogue with something on the other side, so that it's not just us having to solve it by ourselves, even as one collective, but there is a dialogue with, which obviously also has to be part of the one, but maybe the Akashic field has a consciousness that wants to be known by us. I don't know if that's an experience that you think you can, what you've experienced resonates with that, but it rings true to me, certainly from that first psilocybin journey, where I was in this field of consciousness, and it was very strong that there was a consciousness that was way beyond my comprehension, but that nevertheless cared deeply about all of us. And I think somehow, if we can find a way of dialogue, of aligning ourselves with that, that would be a good thing.
I feel what you're suggesting is something that I have experienced. Now, how do you necessarily frame a connection to some kind of positive but higher source, right? So let's say that there's guides out there, or there's some kind of energetic space that is trying to communicate with us, or some kind of higher space. Some people might call it our higher self. Some people might call it the Dakinis, or Buddhists might call it the Dakinis, or female bodhisattvas. there are these kind of entities that are meant to be able to help us, and they have kind of energetic spaces that you can go into. I reference this because I'm just wondering whether how we frame these, we could frame them as external spaces, or you can frame them as perhaps parts of our own psychology that we're mapping out. Right? So rather than see it as an external spirit or an entity, maybe they're parts of our brain or parts of our bodies that we've locked off to. We open up to the energy in there, and the idea is to integrate it as part of ourselves rather than externalize it. And it might be the case that the difference between the shamans in South America, where they might externalize those spaces as spirits, and that's useful for them. It could be that in India, where they said don't ignore the spirits, they just kind of bypass them and try and go straight to the top. But I do think you're right. I think there's something. If there was one day a book to be written about this whole experience, there are ways to navigate this, and there are spaces that are very helpful. But because we're just going in this very blindly, we're just trying to work out what's happening. We don't really even have a language to really understand what's going on. But I think the psychological map is quite a useful map. And the Jungian map is quite useful because it might be suggesting that we're mapping our own psychology, individually and collectively. Because if we are all connected, then in our community, there are going to be spaces that are individual and spaces that are collective, but they're still part of our energetic map. And we can begin to map these in a way that makes sense for us and our communities. I'm not sure whether that makes sense.
I think it does. I wonder whether it's and. I mean, it may be that it's not either one thing or the other. Maybe it's just different ways of understanding what's going on. If the explicate order of our bodies, our psyche, our way of understanding our language comes out of the implicate order, which is this akashic field, or the consciousness that underpins everything, then whatever that dialogue is with is both part of us and more. So I think it's not one or the other. You can understand it in both ways, and probably lots of other ways as well that we haven't even thought of.
No, so what might be happening then? Maybe we're all mapping out consciousness. So there's a global growth into the conscious space. We're mapping it out, and we don't understand what we're mapping, but we're mapping it the best we can. We're coming back and we're talking about it. And in the future, perhaps that map will be much better understood. But I guess what we're all saying is it's a global map. It's not separate maps of different cultures. There's one map of consciousness that we're mapping out together globally. And some people are coming through it through one way, some people are coming through another way. And then there seems to be crossovers happening as well. But because it's a very new thing for us, we're just trying to understand the language and the way to describe it. But the one thing that links it all, going back to this kind of energetic space that links everything together, that's non-material, and that we can enter. And once we're in there, we have these kind of transcendental, numinous experiences.
No, I agree.
So the great opportunity there is that in previous times, each culture has been very separate, hasn't it? And the real opportunity now is it's not exactly a global culture, but there is sort of a global culture, and all these different spiritual paths. There's a light shining down each path, wherever you might live in the world. So, and as Samir was saying in the beginning, each path offers a certain aspect. So, the Hindu path is more up there, and the shamanic path is more earth based. And I would say that in the West, both those traditions have mentioned the Western way, but the Western way has that nature based aspect and the hermetic aspect, which is not higher base, but basically it's mixing these various traditions. These various traditions are being, for whatever reason, mixed up, and sometimes totally intuitively. So, for instance, in my case, I had, what I've basically read sounds like quite a traditional, in a sense, Kundalini awakening, but I haven't really been that versed in the tradition. But it just seems to be everything has seemed to be put into the into that cauldron, as I said.
Yeah.
So
how do we? I mean, we're doing this now, but how can we create a container to help integrate these different perspectives? Because that seems to be what we're trying to do, to not say this is right and this is wrong, or but to say they all are facets of a crystal. They all contribute light to what we're trying to understand. And how do we because when I was doing my project for the training, I just found it really difficult to translate. You can't translate these different traditions into each other. It doesn't work. So we need to. Is it that we need to find a different, rather than a cognitive understanding, have an intuitive understanding or a different kind of language? Or how do we capture that integration?
That's a really great question. A really, really good question. Something that we've been thinking about for a long time. And I think the first thing is not, you can't just translate these concepts. So that's why I always have an issue with the word Kundalini going into other spheres, because they start with a specific meaning and then the meaning gets shifted. And I think to some extent that's okay, but you have to before you jump into the future idea of what Kundalini is, let's understand what it is to begin with. And the same with ayahuasca and what it does to us and why we're doing it. So first thing is to really discuss it with the indigenous practitioners, be they Indian, Buddhist, to really understand what's happening from their perspective. Where is it coming from? And then also acknowledge the fact that something new is happening. And some of these people who are stuck in their traditions, they won't agree with what we're saying. They'll say, no, you're not having Kundalini awakening, or you can't go through that. It can only happen this way. So you have to respect where they're coming from and also accept something new is happening. And there is this kind of unifying space of all these different cultures coming together. So I think we have to develop a language. That's the first thing. And that language has to be respectful of the past, but acknowledge the present and future. And we're trying to do that all together. So Kundalini could be a word we use as an umbrella term for all these different experiences. We should still understand what it really means. But the other thing which I think is important is to have conversations like this. It's to really start to try to articulate, because I know we're finding it all difficult to articulate what is really going on. And I wonder whether the best container, so I'm having this in a dialogue at the moment. What is the best container to have a conversation about this? Is the best container the idea of spiritual and Kundalini awakening in and of itself, to have that conversation and have a vehicle for this? Or is it something, and I think for me this might be where I'm going, is it something else? And I feel that to start the conversation, if we just go back to the basic principle that every culture acknowledges a non-material existence, a connection between all things, plus recent advances in science and studies in consciousness are saying the same thing. So the 2022 Nobel Prize of Physics was given to three physicists who proved, remember correctly, quantum entanglement. Who they developed the experiments that prove that the universe is non-local. So that means the universe is nothing's localized. That actually we're all one. That we all exist in the same space and same time. That's not too dissimilar what the Hindus said Brahman is, or this kind of universal substance that unites all things. So we're coming to a time where that science and spirituality are kind of saying the same thing, or they're beginning to say the same thing. So if we begin with the idea that our present view of reality is not right, and that something is incredibly wrong, and that every culture has said this. Science is saying it, psychology is saying it, not, conscious studies and consciousness might be saying the same thing. There's something more to life than the material. Then suddenly we have to acknowledge that we're operating with a massive block. And, I don't know whether this answers your question, but that is, I think that is the important question, which is what is wrong with our society? Why are people suffering? Why do we feel that there's something missing? Why are there 5 million people in Britain who are claiming mental health benefits? Because, there's something going on. Well, if you look at society, we don't acknowledge the truth, which we're all connected. So spiritual awakening fits in there, because spiritual awakening is a human species, it's a species reaction to the lack of connection, that people are kind of bursting open like cans. They're so blocked, the cans are fizzing and they're bursting open, because society is blocking us off from the real truth that we're all connected. So I wonder whether the framework should be a kind of the idea of social and political change based upon these ideas, and whether spiritual awakening is part of that bigger question. Yeah. Because then that's not just about us, it's about everybody. It's an inclusive question. It's like, how can we create real change? And what is that change based on? Well, the idea that all things are connected, that you can't do something without affecting the whole world effectively. Every action we do has a reaction, and that'll come back onto us. Yeah. That's kind of where I'm at. That's the only vehicle that can contain for me everything, and also it adds urgency to what we're going through, not for us individually, but for all of us collectively.
And that reminds me. So, Alan, you asked me how it had changed me, and I think the biggest change for me was that contact with the numinous. I'd always had existential angst and a longing for connection. We live in an alienated culture. And once I had that connection, that experience of being one with that field of consciousness, that existential angst was taken away. And I think it's that image of drinking from a well, and I guess that's what's kept me going back to using psychedelics periodically, and to opening up at night to the energy, if it will come, is that longing for connection, and that sense of not being cut off from the whole, whatever that is. And I totally agree, Samir, that as a humanity as a whole, we need to somehow create experiences for people where they can have that sense of connection.
And it doesn't have to start off by being transcendental. It can, if we acknowledge the fact at the ground level that we're all connected.
Yeah.
It actually starts with human interaction. It doesn't have to start with taking psychedelics and having a transcendental experience.
True.
Alan, you want to say something?
No, well, it's all about love, and it's about love and connection and community, and ultimately, when people are on their deathbed, I think they very rarely talk about, I wish they had even a better sort of Chelsea tractor. They would be thinking about their loved ones, and it's really trying to bring that through. And I think this, in a way, the tragic thing, I think people know that subconsciously, but so to me, spiritual awakening is just it's not an individual thing. To me, it's a collective, and it's about spreading that sense of connection. And as you, it's political, it's social, it's everything, because everything is interconnected. So I see, I do see that the process in this culture, at this time, as being necessarily to do with, linked to community action, and it's how we treat people, isn't it? If you're more connected, we all have our bad days, but but it's being kind, it's getting people together and making a positive difference, and that's essentially, to me, what the point of our lives are, really, is to make that small positive difference. And I mean, that's the potential, because if we all made that small positive difference, then things would actually move in the right direction.
But are we saying, or have we decided upon the link between psychedelics and the Kundalini experience? Are we saying that they're ways into the same space from different places? They start at different points, but they end up in the same place.
I think that is what I'm saying, but also that psychedelics are a way of relaxing our ego, our body armor, the default mode network, so that the energy is more able to flow. So the psychedelic is a way of opening up to the inner healing tendency, or Kundalini, or whatever you want to call it.
I also want to add, just based upon what you said, what Alan said just at the end, that actually spiritual awakening doesn't make it's irrelevant unless we can connect in real life, unless we bring that energy back and embody it in everyday life experience, in our family, in our community. It's kind of meaningless. So the pursuit of spiritual awakening in and of itself is meaningless. The how we live post that experience and how we embody that experience in our everyday lives is what the awakening process really is. But that can be quite a difficult and painful process, because when you begin to embody it, you have to face some of your traumas. And I guess the psychedelic experience is similar to that to some extent. If you are really willing to be open to it, then it will help you face some of the things that you carry. And that is an awakening process, but you have to be ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would certainly echo that. Without exception, I think each of my journeys have included painful experiences as much as blissful ones. Yeah. And some of them were just painful without any blissful aspects. Yeah.
I want to add that I don't really discuss my psychedelic experiences that much, but I've had a couple, what people might call bad trips, have been the most powerful and awakening journeys for me, the least pleasant, and the ones where I really thought, what's happening here? I've learned the most from. But you have to be able to accept, when you go into a psychedelic space, that is not always going to be pleasant. And if you can understand what it's trying to tell you, there's no such thing as a bad trip, but you really have to be present in that really, really, really uncomfortable space. I don't know whether you remember, Alan, I called you once after I had an LSD experience, and it was pretty profound and pretty difficult. But actually, it was really, 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 really kind of ego breaking. So I think this is the other thing to understand, which is it's not an easy process. And if you really are going to experience it and go into it, you have to be prepared to go into places that are very difficult. But if you are open to that journey, it can be really transformative. But you have to be open to the difficulty that it might present you.
Yeah. And part of that is good setting.
Yeah.
To not just go into it randomly, but to prepare for it properly, to get good support around it, to have good support while you're in the journey. It's a big responsibility to enter those places in your inner world, because they can be overwhelming, and you need the support with it.
Yeah.
So the setting and preparation and integration work are really important.
And it has to be said, it's not without its risks. I mean, there are people that do enter perhaps unprepared, and
maybe get re-traumatized.
The eggshell is smashed, but not necessarily able to put back together again.
There's an interesting concept around that that was coined by Tim Reed, which is high archetypal penetrance. So when your ego perhaps gets blown open and it's not handled well, then you can be left with too much archetypal stuff coming into your everyday awareness, so that you have a spiritual emergency and you can't function so well in your everyday life for a period of time. So yeah, I mean, the dangers are there, definitely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your work now? So you integrate some of these, you help people integrate psychedelic experiences, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not working as a therapist myself. I'm not trained as a therapist. I'm a counselor, but it's a long time ago that I trained. So what I am involved with is running a psychedelic integration group, which is really a facilitated peer support group. So there are four facilitators. They might not all be there every time, but there's at least two facilitators. And we just invite people to share in a structured way so that it's safe and it's confidential. And it's just a space for people to talk like we're talking now, what experiences we've had, what's been difficult, what's been amazing. And we learn from each other. I'm also involved with the Imperial College PsilOCD trial. So that's giving people psilocybin for OCD to see how they respond to that. But I'm just a volunteer guide. I'm not a lead on anything. So yeah, I'm not working as a therapist myself.
What's the name of your
But there are people who are.
what's the name of your support group, the psychedelic support group?
Or the Cambridge Psychedelics.
Okay, so we'll
And
put up.
it's advertised through the Psychedelic Society, and tickets can be booked on Dandelion Earth, the booking platform.
Okay, so we'll put all that in the notes to the video.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So, any last things you want to share?
No, I'm delighted with our conversation. It's been so interesting, and yeah, it feels like there's so much more that we haven't even, we could talk another couple of hours, but thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jeanette. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette.